Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our FCC's Revocation of Consent webinar. We will be discussing these new regulatory changes under the TCPA, which are going into effect April 11th. These rules are designed to simplify the process for consumers to withdraw their consent from receiving calls and text. Of course, if they make it easier for consumers, that typically means it's more challenging for businesses. So we wanted to share these updates with you as quickly as possible. I'm Eric Tehead, the Vice President of Marketing for Possible Now, and I'm joined today by Kevin Mayfield, Managing Consultant for the Marketing Compliance Group from our sister company, Compliance Point. He'll provide the regulatory overview, and AC Evans is the co-founder and CEO of Drips, which provides conversations as a service using texting, calling, and voicemail. He'll share some of the real-world challenges he sees in the marketplace related to actually complying with this regulation. At the end of the webinar, we will have a Q&A session to answer your specific questions. And we'll also send you out a recording of this presentation. So with that, Kevin, please get us started.
All right, thanks for that, Eric. I think we're first going to jump in and talk about the overall rules, and we'll start with who's going to be affected by this. And basically, it's going to be anybody that's placing robocalls, robotexts, and or pre-recorded messages. So I think traditionally a lot of us think of robocalls as pre-recorded messages. And that's not necessarily the definition here. So robocalls, the FCC is defining those as including live agent calls sent with an automatic telephone dialing system, or ATDS. Now, we're not going to go over the definition of that today. We're going to assume that everybody on the call knows what that is and what that definition means. But if you don't and you have questions about that, please don't hesitate to follow up. Also going to be regulating those using robotexts. So that's going to be any SMS messages sent with an automatic telephone dialing system. And it also includes pre-recorded messages. So pre-recorded messages are going to include, voicemail drops, if you're using avatar, soundboard technology, any kind of artificial voice on the calls and those types of things. So pretty broad category. And it's really important, too, to understand that this is applying to both informational and marketing calls and texts. So it's not just the marketing ones that you have to worry about. And that's one of the more difficult things that we see clients struggling with whenever they're using this regulated technology to send both informational and marketing calls. And the FCC's made it official. They've long been of the opinion that calls are texts and texts are calls, but now they've gone to the trouble of codifying that. If you're using an ATDS, calls are texts, texts are calls, and for that matter, pre-recorded messages are texts. So, you're going to have to follow the same rules when it comes to revoking a consumer's consent, regardless of those three communication channels. All right, moving right along, the FCC has also defined what they deem as reasonable consent for a revocation. So, regardless if it's used in the text messages opt-out instructions, the words on your screen there, the FCC has deemed those as reasonable responses by consumers to convey that they no longer want those communications. So the important thing here is you want to make sure whatever system that you're utilizing is automatically recognizing at minimum, these 7 responses by consumers. The FCC also has made it pretty clear that revocations aren't going to be limited to this list, and those would be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So, you could presumably have somebody respond, don't text me anymore, or I don't want these, or even Spanish stop requests, or misspellings of the word stop, could be deemed by a judge in some court somewhere to be reasonable. So our recommendation is that at minimum, that you're going to perform a manual review of all responses not recognized by your texting platform, and also audit any kind of published email addresses that you've got living out there. We had one client. I'm thinking about specifically on a do not call request. They went to their home webpage and sent an email to info@ thecompany.name.com. Well, that was not a monitored email address. So, they continued to call that individual. So you want to make sure that whatever, contact methods you've got published out there, that those are being monitored for any potential revocations, because that's going to be a tactic that could be used by a plaintiff. And certainly you want to be able to ensure that revocations can be honored on inbound phone calls, by live agents, somebody calling into your customer service line, that those folks have the ability to honor those revocations. You might also consider including a callback number in the SMS. Now that texts are officially calls, especially on marketing texts, marketing calls require that you provide your telephone number or address of your business. So, it's reasonable to think that you would also be required to include your telephone number on an outbound marketing text. And that number should be somewhere that they could call and revoke their consent for future texts. And ultimately, in all of this, the FCC is trying to make it easy as possible for consumers to revoke their consent. I think that in their eyes, companies have tried to make it difficult, and I think those days are over. All right, as far as the time frame to honor revocations, they've said, within a reasonable time, not to exceed 10 business days. So historically, on marketing calls, for example, we've always had the 30-day rule for do not call. But again, it has language similar to this, within a reasonable time, not to exceed 30 days. So it doesn't mean that you automatically get 10 business days by default. If your systems allow you to do it quicker, then you're going to be expected to do it quicker. And we've seen some recent court cases where even text opt-outs being honored in 4 days. The judges have allowed those cases to move forward to trial and let a jury decide whether 4 days was enough. And the FCC also stated that they reserve the right to adjust this time frame as necessary in the future as technologies advance. So, as technologies get slicker and slicker, the ability for companies to claim that it takes them longer to honor these requests is going to diminish over time. All right, so let's talk about confirmation and clarification texts. And these other rules are going to go into effect on April 11th. This has been around now since April 4th of 2024. And this is a really kind of a gray area, and maybe AC and I can get into talking about it a little bit more later in the call. But basically, businesses are going to be able to send a one-time text message to confirm an opt-out. So I reply, stop. You can then send me a confirmation text within 5 minutes of that stop request, just to confirm, hey, Kevin, we got your opt-out. You'll no longer receive text messages from us. Those messages cannot contain any further marketing or promotional messages, and you cannot persuade the consumer to try to change their mind. So somebody that wants to throw in on the confirmation text, reply start to opt back in, that could potentially be problematic if challenged in court. You're also allowed to send clarification texts. So let's say that a consumer has opted in to hearing from you about multiple categories of things via text message. and I get a fraud alert text, and I've opted into fraud alerts and low account balance alerts, for example, and I reply stop to a fraud alert. In that confirmation text where you're telling me you've received my opt out, you can also say, hey, Kevin, you're also you've opted out of fraud alerts. You're also opted into low balance alerts. If you would like to continue to receive those, press 1, for example. It doesn't, in our opinion, apply for marketing consent when you have one blanket consent for calls, texts, and pre-recorded messages, let's say. And in our opinion, it does not allow you to say, hey, Kevin, you've opted out of texting. Would you still like to receive calls and pre-recorded messages? That's different, we think, than where you're allowing me to opt into different categories of communications. Now, a court could see that very differently, but in our opinion, that's the spirit of the law. If a clarification text is sent and no response is received, then that has to be considered an opt-out of everything. And interestingly enough, they didn't allow any time frame for the consumer's response to that clarification text. So, there's going to be a little bit of a business decision on your part. Hey, if we don't get a response within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, I'm not sure how you would go about coming up with that time frame. But if you don't receive a response on the clarification of the type of text they want to receive, then you're going to have to assume that they want to opt out of everything.
Kevin, thank you for that overview. The reality is that over 80 countries have privacy regulations, a lot of which contain consent provisions, and a number of states in the U.S. are adding consent regulations. Yet most companies still offer basic consent or no consent options to their customers and prospects. And with this new FCC regulation, it's becoming increasingly important to have a solid consent infrastructure in place. So I'd like to go through what we recommend when it comes to collecting, managing, and revoking consent from a system and process standpoint. So I'll start with tip number 1. When you collect consent, it's important to have the ability to collect consent opt-ins or consent revocation for discrete communication programs such as marketing communications, product updates, service, or mandatory alerts. And then tip number 2, you should collect consent along the customer journey, whether that's on the front end of a relationship when a prospect is shopping and you collect the basic information such as what they're interested in, their contact information, and consent to send them text and automated messages. Or when they're registering a new product, you can collect their address and preferred communication options for product updates. And then, finally, the final example, when they need support, how do you prefer to be contacted? So collecting consent along the customer journey is a more natural way to ask for consent, and you're more likely to be successful in getting it. Of course, all those consents that you collect can come through any number of channels and from any department, such as call centers or CRMs, your website, a point of sale, or maybe an email campaign that you send out. So wherever your customers are interacting, it's important to design those experiences so that they're streamlined and they collect only the needed information. Then you need to store those consents in a centralized repository so that everyone throughout the organization can access them from their specific platform, such as your marketing automation platform, your CRMs or CDPs, whether that's through real-time APIs, batch, or webhooks, doesn't matter, but everybody needs to be connected. So by centralizing and sharing this data across your organization, consumers can manage their consent from any touch point, and the organization can honor their wishes as they communicate from their respective systems. And that's important because consumers think of companies as a single entity. So they expect each department to know when it's okay and not okay to send communications, regardless of who they share that opt-in or opt-out with. For example, if sales is doing an outbound campaign and they can revoke their consent, marketing better be aware of that when they do their next campaign. Because honoring their wishes builds trust and it helps you avoid regulatory fines, lawsuits, and brand damage. So just last year, TCPA lawsuits went up 26% in terms of volume, and the average fine grew to $6.6 million. So that's definitely something you want to avoid. So now let's look at an example of how revocation of consent is handled with an SMS provider such as DRIPS. So the consumer's texts stop or unsubscribe to revoke their consent for receiving newsletters via their mobile device. And we always recommend making the opt-out language specific to the campaign. So when the consumer's text stop, the mobile provider sends a confirmation text that says you have been opted out of the newsletter. And if their opt-out is not specific, you can send a clarifying text to ask, do you want to opt out of everything or just the newsletter? But we recommend it being specific. That information is then integrated into My Preferences, and we immediately transition that revocation of consent, including the consent attributes such as the phone number, date and time of the opt-out, and which channel they used to opt out. And we store that information within My Preferences, at which point it's available across the organization. And you can manage consents, view the history of consents, and audit consents along with their corresponding attributes so that you can build a defensible position in the event of a regulatory inquiry. So that's a fairly straightforward example for someone texting stop for a specific program, in this case, newsletter, but life's not always that straightforward. So I want to bring in AC, CEO of DRIPS, into the conversation. AC, you work with a lot of insurance and healthcare providers and others for that matter. What are companies saying related to this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And Kevin, thanks for breaking down the rule. It's a difficult one, right? I mean, to be able to capture revocation of consent by any reasonable means, right? Like, what does that mean? You know, if I go into a local insurance agency that's under a large national insurance brand and I ask them to stop texting me, does that mean that local insurance agent has to get that information back to the main enterprise? It becomes very difficult. I think it was Kevin, you shared earlier the story about the information at email. So there's so many ways consumers can come into an organization and try to revoke consent. And I'm sure, pro plaintiffs and others will exploit that. It's a terribly difficult thing to navigate. But when I think about it, I think of three disparate issues that I see our clients and the industry facing. One is what I just said, the reasonable means, and not just, all the different channels of which a consumer could revoke consent, but also, this rule essentially purports to say that you have to have a human level of understanding for your automated systems. You have to have a human level of understanding of what people are saying back, right? Which DRIPS, we do NLP. We've been doing this for a long time. We have a great model that does this, but I've seen cases recently where big healthcare companies were stuck in cases because they didn't understand the term duck, right? Which is obviously a typo for an explicit. That could be considered reasonable, right? It's reasonable if somebody says, stop blowing up my phone. So that's tough, right? That's a tough one. The next is the clarification piece, which I think most companies will figure out and most platforms will build in. It's essentially saying, okay, well, we'll remove you from billing, response stay if you want to get other important messages about your healthcare. But the last, and this is probably the most difficult, and this is something I know Possible Now helps with, is the data interoperability issue, right? Like some of the bigger the company, the harder this problem is. And we work with, the biggest insurance companies, the biggest healthcare payer companies, healthcare provider companies there are. This is a really tough thing. I mean, a lot of these businesses were segmented and siloed on purpose, for privacy reasons, for different business reasons. There's M&A involved, different companies buy other healthcare plans, and that data is completely siloed and it's not centralized. So A lot of companies are kind of scrambling, trying to figure out how to centralize it. Other companies are leveraging tools and companies and platforms like Possible Now to try to centralize it. But I think that's probably the biggest of the problem, is just getting this data and getting access to it.
Great. So, how are you seeing people react to this in general?
Yeah, in general, again, the three different problems, right? One is, let's start with the top, right? The reasonable means. So a lot of companies, if they have low volume, I've seen them actually using humans, right? Like they have like literal humans that are sitting there and sorting, saying, okay, not a revocation is a revocation, not a revocation is a revocation. And some companies have done that already, right? That doesn't necessarily scale, right? If you get a big influx of responses, now you're past that 5-minute mark, right? So that's tough. Others are using platforms, right? They're using platforms like Drips to solve this problem for them. Others are taking, lists, like large lists, that say, remove or stop or cancel, or, maybe a bunch of swear words, things like that. And they're just doing a very simple, if this response contains any of these words, then let's treat it like an opt-out. Again, I think pro plaintiffs will drive a truck through that, right? There's a lot of very clever ways you could reasonably remove yourself or ask to revoke your consent that wouldn't have any of those keywords in it. Some are looking at LLM, right? Now with the advent of ChatGPT and other LLMs, you can leverage those types of tools, but that opens up a whole nother can of worms when it comes to privacy, when it comes to data security, when it comes to, what you can and can't share with those LLMs. So that has its own issues. And the last is, kind of an overcorrection, right? Like if somebody texts back and you're not sure it's not an opt-out, I've seen companies that may take the stance that they're just going to treat it like one, right? So that's how they're handling, the NLP. The clarification piece, as I said, I think texting platforms are going to build kind of those back and forths in, and the data interoperability. Again, they're either pushing their different business units to integrate with their member orchestration or preference management tools, or they're looking to use a third party like Possible Now.
Perfect. So when complying with consent revocation, are there best practices that you can share that you're seeing organizations leverage?
Yeah, to me, I think it's all about strategy, right? I think, how can you not inundate a user, because that's what, arguably kicked off this, this legislation in the first place, was that people were getting too many messages from different departments and different companies. So first and foremost is like doing an audit of, okay, where are we calling, texting, and even emailing and others, even though those aren't regulated by the same regulation, and saying, okay, like, is this too much? Right? Because if it's too much, you're going to inundate users. They're going to look to revoke their consent, and whether you clarify or not, you're going to start to lose, your preferences and access to reaching your members. The next, my favorite way to stop an opt out is to not get one in the first place, right? Like, don't push a user to opt out. So if you think of, let's just say you're doing a texting campaign, about a billing reminder. Like, what if you, instead of saying, response stop to be removed from billing, what if you said, let us know if you already paid this bill, right? Or if you've already handled this, just let us know. And they say, yeah, I've already handled it. Great. That's not a revocation of consent, right? That's not a stop message. That's just somebody saying they've already handled the reason that you're reaching out. So, we call those closeouts. I think Possible Now calls them opt downs. But the idea is, like, stop the conversation before you drive a person to opting out and revoking consent in the first place. Give the people, the chance to tell you that they're not interested in the product, tell you that they've already paid the bill, tell you that they've already set up an appointment, right? Before you push them, too far to an opt out. That's why, for Drips, we focus on conversations, because it's very easy to get those colloquial closeouts, as we ask, hey, did you pay this bill? And they say, yeah, I did. And we go, okay, great. Have a good day,
Yeah, no, absolutely. We align on that very nicely, and believe in the same thing, so that you can have discrete conversations. So that's good feedback. So finally, AC, how can Drips help organizations comply with this regulation? What's your secret sauce?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversations is the secret sauce, right? I think there's a ton of strategy that goes into, how you navigate reaching out to consumers. I think there's thoughtful ways you can build, really consumer-centric member journeys where you're not inundating people. I think you need to work with platforms and get your data in a place where you understand how often you're reaching out to a member. Again, that's one of the biggest problems. The bigger the company, the more, siloed their lines of businesses may be. Some big healthcare companies, they have, pharmacy groups and PBMs and Medicaid, Medicare, and ACA, and all these different things, and marketplaces, and all these different care gap closures, all these different reasons they need to reach out, and a lot of times those leaders and those systems aren't yet talking to each other. So I think it starts with strategy, and I think it starts with making sure you're not over inundating your consumers, right, your members. And then I think it's about not getting the opt out in the first place, right? So A, don't inundate them. B, have conversations with them. Make sure you're not sending them superfluous information. Make sure you're giving them the chance to close the conversation without revoking their consent. There's a lot of people, they may not want that, right? Like if Amex, is sending me mileage, points, whatever, I'm not really interested in that, but I do want to know if I forgot to pay my bill, right? So making sure you have these mechanisms in there to clarify your preferences, to clarify your consent revocations is ultra important.
Excellent. Well, thanks for your feedback. Kevin and AC, thanks for your insights today. If anyone has any questions you would like to ask, please use the chat pane to send those to us. And as a reminder, we will send you the webinar recording if you would like to reference it in the future or share that with others in your organization. All right, well, so let's jump into the questions. We've been getting quite a few of them. This first one, Kevin, I'll throw your direction. Can you discuss if the new revocation rules are broadly applicable to all calls and texts or just certain types of calls and texts?
Well, it's going to be calls and texts using regulated technology. So, robocalling, robo-texting. We've long kind of advised our clients that the safest course of action is to treat your calling and texting technology as if it were an ATDS, even though you may think it's not, right? If you operate under those conditions, then no plaintiff's going to be able to claim that you're using an ATDS. So you're getting the proper level of consent. You're revoking consent across, the different communication channels. When you get an opt-out stop request, you treat those as a DNC and so forth. Now, I think maybe what you're asking here is maybe marketing versus informational. So, the rules say that if you're using regulated technology, an opt-out of one is going to be an opt-out of all unless you're able to clarify that, which I know we talked about earlier. I don't know, AC, you have any additional insight on that?
No, that sounds right. I think you nailed it.
Okay, great. So AC, this next one is, I think, for you. Does this mean that the text saying something like type stop to opt out, the customer can use these or other words as well, even if the text instructions give these words?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what the question I think is asking is if you give a specific, disqualification disclaimer, right, like stop, and then a consumer responds in some other way other than stop, do you still need to honor it? And I think it's unequivocally yes. Right now, the rule, the regs, what they really say is, a user can revoke their consent via any reasonable means, right? And how reasonable means is determined is by a totality of circumstances, right? So one could argue that, well, we gave them the word, the term stop, but they misspelled stop, or they, said quit, or whatever it was. But then it's going to be up to the business to explain why that is not a reasonable request from a consumer. And we've seen court cases, very recently where people were stuck in these court cases for health insurance companies that use the term duck off, right? And that was determined to be reasonable enough of a revocation request. So I think people have to really assume that if a human would read it and presume that person is reasonably, stating that they don't want to get these calls or texts or ask to be removed from calls or texts, then they should honor it as an opt-out.
All right, thank you. And so the next one, and it probably would be good for you, AC, is can you clarify if these are just revocation of consent to be contacted by the regulated technologies, but would we still be able to reach out with non-regulated regulated technology if the consumer is not on a internal DNC list?
Yeah, I think this is sort of addressed earlier, right? When it's, is it broadly applicable to all calls and texts or just certain types? And yeah, look, if it's not regulated, it's not regulated, right? So if you are hand calling somebody for administrative purposes, there's no regulation, at least the TCPA is not regulating that, right? And this rule wouldn't as well. That's again, if you're picking up a phone and hand dialing somebody and not using pre-recorded voice and not using ATDS, it would not be regulated. You do have the DNC rules to adhere by, right? So the telemarketing sales rules and DNC rules that are underneath those. So you need to make sure you're scrubbing against potentially state and not federal and of course internal lists. But really, that's what you should be thinking about. Like, really, this is saying that they're able to more easily be removed from automated outreach, in kind of a nutshell. But, I think of this kind of like a doctor's office. So if I tell my doctor's office to stop sending me appointment reminders, but maybe they need to reach out to me for something important, right? They gave me the wrong medicine, whatnot. They wouldn't be able to use my consent that I revoked to use an automated system, but they would be able to pick up the phone and call me.
Terrific. Thank you, Kevin. This one, I'll have you handle. Are opt-outs of text, which now include calls and recorded message, forward-facing, or do we need to add previous opt-outs to DNC lists as well?
Okay, so when we're talking about DNC lists, I think it's important to remember that only marketing calls apply to the DNC rules. So if we're talking about informational automated texts and calls, I would say that's only going to be required going forward. But we've always long been of the opinion that a stop request on a marketing text was equivalent to an internal DNC request. The FCC they finally codified it, right? But they've long thought that calls are texts and texts are calls. So I think from an informational standpoint, we're only talking about going forward, but from marketing, I think you still need to be looking backwards on that.
Great.
Yeah, and if logistically, right, if somebody opted out of a marketing message on April 5th, right, you wouldn't have the consent going forward on April 11th. So another way to read this question may be if somebody sent a reasonable request prior to April 11th, do you need to somehow batch process those? And I think that's probably more of a legal question and a business decision, but I would think not, since this was a declaratory ruling that says moving forward past April 11th, you need to treat any and all of these things in a very specific way. But yeah, if they lost the marketing consent previous, then they don't have it going into this new space, right?
Great. Kevin, I think I'll throw this one at you as well. How do most organizations obtain consent for detailed voicemails, especially as it relates to an organization that adheres to FERPA guidelines?
Right, so there's a lot of industries that there's calls that they're required to make, right? If there's going to be a big power outage, power companies are required to make those calls where they know people might have medical equipment in their home that need power and things of that nature. There's nothing, though, that says that you have to make those calls via pre-recorded message. So, you still need the proper level of consent to make a pre-recorded message to someone's cell phone. So that is just simply they gave you their telephone number during the normal course of business. I'm not familiar with these FERPA guidelines specifically, but I have to assume you're talking about informational messages rather than marketing messages, right? So you only need their express consent. They gave you the phone number with no instructions to the contrary on how you can use it. But people can revoke that consent for pre-recorded messages. Hey, I don't want you to call me anymore on my cell phone with these pre-recorded messages. If we're talking about a landline, there's nothing they can do about it. You can keep making them anyway, but we're talking about a cell phone. They can revoke that consent. You may very well still be required to make those calls, but you would not be able to make those via pre-recorded message.
Thank you, sir. AC, I think I'm going to throw this one at you. But the question is, how do you overlay the conversational flow? For example, did you pay this bill versus stop with the CTIA guidelines for short codes?
I'm not quite sure what specific, if somebody asked this in the chat, maybe they can get a little more clear on what they mean with the CTA guidelines. But the guidelines effectively, I mean, it's a 20-page document, right? So there's a lot of guidelines in there. So I'm not sure exactly what part they're saying. Can you ask the question one more time, just so I?
Yeah. So how do you overlay the conversational flow with the CTIA guidelines for short codes? And we can always follow up later if we need to.
Yeah, let me look at it. So example, did you pay this bill versus stop? Okay, so I think what they're asking is, how do you keep it conversational? Like here's the important part, right? So what they're saying is, say I said, did you pay this bill, right? And somebody says, yeah, I paid it. I don't have any further reason to reach out to them, right? I'm not exactly sure how that correlates to CTIA in this question. And again, if somebody can clarify, that'd be great. But I think you got to look at a couple things. So I consider these what we call closeouts. I believe Possible Now calls them opt-downs, last time I recall talking to y'all. So essentially, somebody is indicating that they no longer need the outreach that you're giving them, but they are not revoking consent, right? They're saying, I paid the bill, I took the medicine, I picked up my prescription, I don't need to file this claim anymore, things like this, right? So again, we call these closeouts, and we have pretty strong legal opinion around this, where these are not revocations, but it's still a good reason to stop reaching out for this specific purpose. And because they're not a revocation, you don't need to seek clarification. Now, if they say stop or end or cancel or leave me alone or take me off your list or anything else like that, then you would want to seek clarification. You would want to treat that as revocation.
Great. Kevin, I'll throw this one at you. If we're providing a callback number and a pre-recorded message, does that suffice? Can a customer call that number in business hours and ask the customer care agent to not call, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a good one. So, from the TCPA's perspective, on an informational pre-recorded message call, you only need to provide a callback number where that person can call and revoke their consent. On a marketing pre-recorded message, you would have to provide an automated key press type scenario. But the important thing, I think, to understand is that if somebody does call that number and they're speaking to one of your agents and they say, you know what, I don't want your automated calls anymore, you're going to have that agent, if you're also sending automated text messages and your systems aren't talking to one another, you're going to have to figure out a way to make sure that those lists get synced up. And that's where we see companies tripping up a lot of times, is that they'll add that number to their do not call list, and then 6 months, a year from now, somebody comes up with an idea of, hey, this is an informational campaign, why are we scrubbing this against our do not call list? It's in marketing. And now whammo, right? Because now you're not scrubbing that number anymore because you've put it on your marketing do not call list. So I would just say that it's important to understand, for the agents to have the ability to make sure they can revoke consent across all automated communication channels.
Yeah, I think this is the tough one, right? Because the rule is any reasonable means, right? So would it be reasonable for me to handwrite a letter, send it to my local Allstate or any other insurance agent, right, and ask them to take me off their automated messaging, right? And is it reasonable for that agent to have to get that up to, the enterprise somehow? This is really, I think, the toughest part of navigating this. Is there's so many ways that consumers can talk to these large enterprises, and for these large enterprises to make sure that all of their bases are covered, inbound calls, voicemails, mail, responses to email. What if they text in, 1-800, acme.com because they saw a commercial? I mean, there's just so many ways that consumers get a hold of people. This is where I think the serial litigators are going to kind of be able to drive a truck through this thing, because there's just so many ways you could reasonably slip through the cracks, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So next one is, there's currently a narrow definition of ATDS. How easy is it for companies to demonstrate that they are not an ATDS? And is that an effective defense strategy? And there's a part two, will the definition evolve? Kevin?
Right. So, really post Facebook ruling at the Supreme Court, was probably going on 3 years ago now. We've really seen ATDS to wireless cases fall off a cliff. The plaintiffs are really have been historically going after more DNC violations, and due to reassigned numbers and so on and so forth. But you got to remember too, we got these state rules too, which I suspect could get more popular as time goes by. We got Florida, Maryland, Oklahoma that have pretty narrow definitions of what an automated system is, and I think you'd be hard pressed. Pretty much any texting, text blasting platform, for example, you'd be hard pressed to get around that those systems are automatically selecting or dialing the numbers. So I mean, there's multiple things going on here that you got to be concerned about, not just the definition of an ATDS, but we've certainly seen a lot less cases as of late on where plaintiffs have been trying to make the claim of an ATDS. But we still, as a best practice, recommend to our clients to treat your system as an ATDS, because then you eliminate that claim altogether.
All right. The next one.
Just to touch on one thing, Chase, I think something you just said there, Kevin, is really important, is the state rules, right? Like, as more federal rules change, get stayed, get shot down. We just saw what happened to the CFPB recently. Like, it is very, history shows that as federal regulations get changed, states will step in, right? So when SCOTUS and Facebook narrowly defined the ATDS, as y'all said correctly, Facebook and Florida, Oklahoma, Maryland came in with their own rules, right? So I think you could even imagine a world where, now that 1-to-1 was shot down, like, what's to stop a state from saying that they want their consents to be 1-to-1? So I think we should just all go into these next few years expecting more state regulations.
So the next one is, I thought that the FCC stated that an opt-out of text should be treated as a DNC request. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I mean, touched on this a little bit earlier, and maybe that's what prompted the question, but DNC rules, do not call rules, are only applicable to marketing calls and texts. So if you're talking about a purely informational call or text, those are not subject to DNC rules. So, letter of the law, if you're making an informational call to me and using non-regulated technology, non-ATDS, right? And I tell you to stop calling me, theoretically, you could tell me to go pound sand and keep calling me anyway. Now, whether you want to do that, that's a completely different story. But we certainly wouldn't recommend doing that. But you could. So I mean, but a stop request to a marketing text would be equivalent to do not call.
So with more companies using meeting technology such as Microsoft Teams to make outbound calls, does this fit into the definition of ATDS?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could make the argument that you could certainly make the argument that no modern day dialer meets the definition of an ATDS now, and hasn't for years. However, companies have paid out hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements to prevent from having to make that argument. So, I mean, from the safest course of action, you just treat it like it's an ATDS and operate under those rules. Now, certainly, if you're willing to make that argument that it's not an ATDS, you can make the business decision to do that. Obviously, and we probably should have started this out mentioning this, but neither AC, Eric, or I are attorneys. None of us are attorneys on the call today, so definitely recommend checking with your counsel prior to making any final decisions. But there are certainly companies out there that have made the business decision to utilize even automated technology, and they're prepared to make the argument it's not an ATDS. So, but I wouldn't recommend doing that. But it's not to say there aren't companies out there doing it.
AC, this next one is for you. What's the real risk of people opting out in unusual ways? We think most people will follow our keywords like stop.
Yeah, it's a good question. We did a data study recently where we found, I think it was over 5.6 million unique ways to essentially indicate that someone didn't need to get further messaging. Right now, some of those were revocations of consent, opt-outs. Some were more closeouts. But the people text back all kinds of ways, right? And they'll say stop, and they'll put 3 O's in it and an exclamation mark. They'll send colorful emojis, right? They'll use swears. You got to understand, like, people are gonna, companies may be texting like robots, right? Expecting a very prescribed response, but humans are going to text back like humans. So the risk is very high. Now, with normal consumers, most of them are just going to follow the disclaimer that you gave them, right? I'd say like north of 50% of them, but a lot of them, will mess it up, or they may say, stop, I don't need these messages anymore, right? They don't necessarily understand that your systems are looking for a very specific term. So, with the drips, we use, very intelligent NLU, natural language understanding, and map all those things. So you really got to, this new rule purports that companies have to have essentially a human level understanding of any reasonable means, right? So, and that's going to happen. And it's not just the consumers I think people need to worry about. It's really the pro plaintiffs, right? Because pro plaintiffs for sure will not be using stop. I mean, imagine, post April 11th, if this goes through as is, I always use the pizza in the oven analogy, right? A lot of these pizza companies now, national pizza companies, they'll text you and say, hey, your pizza just went in the oven, right? Because I'd opted in for that text, right? Imagine how easy it's going to be for a pro plaintiff to text back and say, yeah, I don't want any more pizza updates, right? That's a reasonable thing to text back. And then, 2 minutes later, that pizza pops out the other end of the oven. That arguably could be a slam dunk TCPA case. So you got to figure out a way to intake these messages, understand what their intents are, and process them appropriately.
All right. So this has been a huge number of questions, and we are grateful for them. The last one we've got here is, what's the best way to minimize consent revocation? And I would say 2 things. Number one, give customers what they want and don't over communicate, because nothing will cause someone to opt out faster than blowing up their phone with irrelevant messages. But also, when they do opt out, the second way you can minimize them is to give them opt-down options, such as, would you like to opt out of just the product updates? Or do you want to opt out of all marketing communications, or do you want to opt out globally? So those are the ways that we like to give customers the opportunity to not opt out, but to fine tune the communications that they're getting. And a lot of times that can include frequency. Maybe they want to hear from you, but they only want to hear from you once a week rather than, twice a day. And if you give them the options to fine tune it, then you know how to deal with them on a more on a basis that they're comfortable with.
Yeah, and I'll
So
add one more there, Chase, is not getting them to opt out in the first place, right? You nailed it with member inundation. That's the first step. But the other way is to have conversations with these people, right? Like ask them questions. Did you already pay your bill, right? Versus you have a bill to pay, response stop to be removed. If they already paid the bill, they're going to respond stop. You ask them a question, did you pay the bill? They may say yes, right? And then you can do what you just said, an opt down, or what we call a closeout. So I think having conversations and doing less push and blast messaging is really going to be important after this regulation goes into effect.
All right. Well, Kevin and AC, thank you very much. And for all the audience, thank you as well for your questions and your time today. If you have questions about Possible products or services, or even compliance point products and services, just reach out to us at that contact information on the screen for Possible Now. And likewise, if you've got questions or want to dive deeper into the DRIPS technology, their contact information is there as well. And the final thing I will share is that in 2 weeks, we will be having a 2025 regulatory update, which will include a 2024 look back, as well as what we anticipate coming up this year for regulations in general as it relates to marketing and communications. That'll be on February 27th, and look forward. We'll start communicating on the specifics on that in the next couple days. So look for that. We'd love to have you back and be able to dialogue with you again in 2 weeks. Thanks for joining us, everybody.